Hi there, it's Deborah Irene coming to you this evening with story time with stories and lessons from my mother, Helen Herbert Gillum. I said that over the next month or two I would be reading the last section of her book, Helen's Heritage, where she devoted a chapter to each one of her siblings and her mom and dad. So just a few days ago, we read about her mother, Rhoda Margaret, and the week prior to that, we read about her father, James Bernard Herbert. I had some things I could not get off of my mind, so I wanted to go ahead and read a little bit more to you about the two of them before we get into each of her sibling chapters. So, in her preface to her book, she had two purposes for writing this book. And I just want to read to you quickly. Number one, her first purpose for writing her biography is that many people have asked me, being her, over the years, what it was like to be part of such a large family with so many brothers and sisters, not to mention cousins, nieces, and nephews. Sometimes I felt looked down upon for our large clan. So I would like everyone to know what a privilege it was and is to have so many loving, caring brothers and sisters. We were there for each other and loved each other no matter what. When I was a little girl, some people pitied me because I was separated from my mother. But I feel I had a wonderful life. God was faithful and worked out everything for good. Those are my mother's words. And when we read 2 weeks ago about her father, James Bernard, I believe that I mentioned to you that I have a pretty good recollection of my aunts and uncles. And he lived with us for 3, 4, maybe 5 years when we first moved to the Midwest from California. So I feel really privileged to have known my grandfather, even though he was more like my great-grandfather. The really unusual part is that I also remember my grandmother, and I was just about 3.5 years old when she died, but she made such an impression on me. And as we read over the next couple of months about each one of my mother's siblings, I feel very blessed because I spent the first 10 years of my life in California. So my mother's brothers and sisters who had migrated to California after my grandmother did, I grew up knowing them. They were just such a big part of my life and my sister's lives. And then when we moved back to the Midwest, that's when I met and became so close with the ones who had stayed in Missouri. So I have recollections of them too. And I feel like I would just like to pay a little more tribute to my grandmother and my grandfather, because I wrote about them as well in my two books, Reflections, and then I have one chapter here about my grandmother in Someday I Will Write. So let's start with my grandfather first. I wrote this book, Reflections, back in 2010. It was published in 2011. And I wrote just a little short vignette about people in my life who had made an impression on me and that I loved. So let's read just a little bit more about James Bernard. Another reason I want to read these stories is that in these stories I have mentioned some of my other aunts and uncles that we will be reading about in the weeks to come. So the title of this chapter is Grandpa. It's my voice, not my mother's, talking about her father, Grandpa. And I wrote this as directly to him. So let's read here. You lived to be 97 years old, amazing, and in good health most of that time, with the exception of your failing eyesight that left you legally blind the last several years. Many times I heard you quote the biblical principle associated with your longevity when explaining the blessing of your long life to your offspring. Honor your father and mother. Although you were blessed with many years, my time with you was short. You were the patriarch of a large clan. You and Mammy produced 8 boys and 8 girls, with 30 years spanning the time between the oldest and the youngest, my mother being the youngest. Since you were 76 years old when I was born and nearly 1,700 miles away in a distant state, I feel very fortunate to have built a relationship with you. I remember that you visited us a few times when we lived in California. You were nice and loved to tickle your grandchildren and great-grandchildren as you pretended to catch mice running all over our bodies. Our bond formed when we moved to the Midwest when I was 9. You lived with us those first 5 years. Little did I know the impact those years would have throughout my lifetime. I believe you claimed farmer as your occupation, and although you never pastored a church, there was no doubt that you were a preacher. I had a desire to understand spiritual things and sat with you frequently to gain this knowledge. You loved to listen to Christian radio broadcasts. If you were out for the evening or not in your bedroom, you didn't mind if I switched the station to listen to the Cardinals baseball game, although I was always careful to turn it back to your favorite station. I would sit with you in one of the 2 chairs separated by a small table next to the double window in your bedroom and listen to whatever story you had for the day. The captivating art of storytelling was inside you. You would take me back decades past and make me feel like I was right in the moment. I now have a true appreciation for that gift. Your bedroom was next to mine, and it was easy to tell who was on your prayer list that day. It became apparent to me even then that parenting is a lifelong venture. When at the age of 90, you called out the names of your grown children and grandchildren in prayer each night. I believe it would be appropriate to say your prayers were offered with much supplication and fervor. I certainly felt that it would be impossible for God to ignore them. Because of your failing eyesight, you walked everywhere with your cane, which was painted white nearly to the handle. I enjoyed walking with you during those years, sometimes to town, weather permitting, as you enjoyed visiting with the other elderly men who gathered at the courthouse on the square of our small town. There was the 7-block walk from the main thoroughfare to our house after attending a weekly Saturday night service at a small church on the other side of town. I don't remember how we got there each time, but I do remember the walks home and the small gathering, which included an evening of worship, singing, testifying, and finally, some 3 hours later, the preaching. The friendly couple who lived on our side of town would have been happy to take us the remainder 7 blocks directly to the house, but you never wanted to be a burden and didn't want anyone to go out of his way. Odd thing was, I didn't mind. You used this time to explain anything I didn't understand that happened at the service. This was our ritual on Saturday nights, unless I had an opportunity to babysit. Of course, there was regular church the next morning. You provided a spiritual foundation for your family, and your passion for seeking the kingdom of God has been passed down through the generations. On occasion, I would spend the night with Aunt Delta, attend services with her, and gained much spiritual insight from this daughter of yours and daughter of the King. You raised a close-knit family full of family gatherings at the park, our home, or one of my aunts or uncles' homes. Oh my, there were so many cousins, second cousins, third cousins, and sometimes cousins I had never met. I believe we were related to everyone in town. and the neighboring counties, either by blood, marriage, or kindred spirit adoption. Those truly were the good days. Grandpa, I believe it would please you to know that we try to replicate those gatherings, if but only once a year. Although you were blessed with good health even in old age, in the last few months, you were cared for in a nursing home. I was in my early 20s and had moved away from our small town when I received the news that you were failing. It bothered me that the last time I saw you, I wasn't sure you recognized me. I knew that you would not want to live this way, and in just a few days, you were gone, at least gone from this life as we know it. You see, I know that you are rejoicing in heaven. I have seen documentaries and read books and articles about death and near-death experiences. In some of these accounts, individuals claim to have seen others who have gone before them, leading or escorting them to the other side. I don't know if this is exactly the way the transition takes place, but this I know for sure. If it is true, you will be there leading me up the pearly white staircase and will teach me that heavenly song. And then perhaps you will play your harmonica and we will swing our clutched hands in time to the music, just like the good old days. And when he would sing, he would keep in time to the music, just like that. And my mother and I both used some of these scriptures because they were so like my grandfather. From Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 9, it says, "Only be careful and watch yourselves closely, so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen, so that we won't forget, or let them slip from your heart as long as you live. Teach them to your children and to their children after them." And from Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 6 through 7, "These commandments that I give you today are to be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road and when you lie down and when you get up." And that's what we're doing right now. You know, my mother's book, she was very clear that this book is not about perfect people. It's about forgiveness and restoration and not living a perfect life, but looking to Jesus as your Savior and trying to do better, but looking to Him. So that's what my grandfather, I know, would want for us, for his descendants, is to teach these things. Don't forget. That's why we wrote things down in the books, so that our family can remember what God has done for them. That's what he would want. So now let me read what I wrote about my grandmother. Now keep in mind that I was only 3.5 years old when she died, but oh yes, I remember. I do remember. I called her Mammy. I don't know exactly why, if I felt like that's what my mother was saying when she said Mommy, but also I think she and a friend of hers used to sing a song to me that had the word Mammy in it, and so I thought that was her name. But so the title of this chapter about my grandmother that my mother wrote about and we read last week, Rhoda Margaret, the title is Mammy, because that's what I called her. I remember. You sat down in the chair with a baking pan full of freshly washed apples and a sharp paring knife. You were a robust woman, like most women in our family, as they approached their twilight years. A full apron covering your soft printed dress, your lap made the perfect work surface, I remember. As you selected the first apple, making a slight incision near the stem, I sat down on the floor in front of you to observe, hoping for a bite of the apple. You began the circular motion of peeling the apple, and I made sure you were aware of my desire. As the peel began to form a coil, you gently spoke to me, explaining how these apples would be used in our dessert for a later meal, an apple pie, and how delicious and nutritious the peel was. It was the very best part of the apple. By the time the peel of the first apple fell into the pan, this almost 3-year-old little girl was a believer and was in awe that you were able to accomplish this without ever breaking the coil. There, you said, try for yourself. I grabbed the peel and savored every bite as I watched you start the same process with the next apple. The perfect coils fell one after another until the task at hand was complete. I remember. Yes, I remember, even though some in disbelief thought there was no way that I could remember. I was too young, so they thought. Someone must have told me that story. Oh no, I remember. You were loving, kind, and funny. You played patient while I played doctor. The shot hurt, and you let me know it. But when it was time to go to bed for the evening, the roles reversed. As you carefully applied vapor rub to my chest, covered the ointment with the t-shirt, and helped me put on my pajamas. I remember. You clapped your hands and tapped your feet as I hula hooped. You let me drink coffee with cream and sugar in a china cup. You had a safe place to play, the courtyard in the front, and the backyard lined with flowers. And if I became frightened because of the stranger in the alley, you quickly came to the door to my rescue. I called you Mammy. I remember. How much I would have loved for you to be with us longer. I missed you so much over the years, especially the teenage years. I wish there could have been years and years to remember. I once told Aunt Lizzie, your oldest daughter, how much I missed you. She smiled and said, so do I. Aunt Lizzie knew that I remembered. As I think back on the apple coils, I am reminded of the circle of life that continues through the generations. Your gifts and talents were present in your daughters. I watched Aunt Lizzie make homemade biscuits for breakfast, churn butter, collect eggs from the hen house, and make homemade ice cream. I witnessed her make a peach pie once in about 5 minutes. I was amazed as she rolled out the dough, laid the peaches in the pie shell, threw it in the oven, and announced she was ready to go. I was in awe, much like watching your apple coils. And how could I forget Aunt Eunice returning home from church, quickly slipping on an apron over her Sunday best, and promptly preparing a meal for however many family members decided to show up for dinner. I remember. Years later, your youngest daughter, my mother, passed on the awesome skill of making and canning apple butter. As we worked up the apples, I once again remembered the apple coils falling into the pan some 30 years earlier, and somehow felt you were smiling down on the process. As each jar sealed with a ping, I felt a great sense of accomplishment. My mother was correct. Each ping was a reward for a job well done. Music to my ears. I remember. I do not remember your passing, and that I do not understand, except perhaps I was too young, as others suggested. I was told that your love of flowers was on display at your funeral, more flowers than one could imagine, and I was told that one of the last things you said was, what a beautiful yellow. Perhaps that's why I always loved yellow. I remember that was to be the theme color in my wedding. Your nativity set is displayed on my coffee table as I write, and I wish you were sitting here with me at this very moment, enjoying the reflection from the flicker of the candle on baby Jesus. I am thankful that somehow God expanded my capacity of recollection to remember you, the good things, and what an honor if in the coil of life someone would say of me, I remember. That was writing about my mother's mother, Rhoda Margaret. And then another little vignette that ended up about her in my book, Someday I Will Write. I woke up one morning in May, and I believe this was May of 2014, yes, and just had her on my mind and looked at dates and realized it was a significant date for her. I do think of her a lot in May. She was born in May, got married in May, and she died in May. And Grandpa used to say everything happened for her in the month of May. So I just got up and kind of reflected on her in this blog that I wrote in May 2014. And I called it Misunderstood Maggie. 55 years ago today, she died, May 4, 1959. She saw yellow, a flower, the sun, or the light of heaven. 4 days later, she was buried on a beautiful spring day, a day like today. Flowers galore lined the church as Cousin Bub carried her crippled brother Ben up the long flight of stairs to take his seat with the family. My mother, 4 months pregnant with her third daughter, traveled with other siblings from California to lay her mother to rest. I don't remember those days, too young, so I am told. But why do I remember other very specific things before that time? Events, her mannerisms, her kindness, where she lived, details that should not be present in the memory of a then 3-year-old little girl. But I do remember. And I learned other things as I researched family history, studied dates and notes, and listened to stories. I find it interesting that my middle son was born 100 years after her, 1888 and 1988. She bore the first name of her maternal grandmother, Rhoda. She was called by her middle name, Margaret, Maggie, or Mag. She was a beautiful young woman, thick hair and wide blue eyes. Consent was required by her mother when she married at the tender age of 16 and was thrust into adulthood on another spring day. Tomorrow is the 110th anniversary of that union. She was a hard worker and a devoted mother. She gave birth to 16 children over 29 years. She lost 1 baby girl and 1 little boy loved by all. She said, "A piece of you dies when your child dies." She worked in the fields like a man, stopping only to nurse the newest baby and prepare meals for the family. Much of this time, she was also pregnant with the next child. She was a woman of faith and taught that faith to others, specifically children. She made a very difficult decision and endured ridicule and criticism by ones who felt worthy to judge. She walked away. She was a strong woman, misunderstood by many who tried to shame her. In the years to come, she held her head high and was respected by all who knew her. She carved out her new life. She continued to work hard. She was loved. As she turned the page of her 71st year, she knew her time was short. Her once vibrant hair now was gray, and her eyes bore the lines of a life not easy. She returned to her Midwest homeland, a journey that would place her arrival a few weeks away from her eternal home. The thing I grasp to remember but cannot. Instead, I remember the apples, the hula hoop, the coffee with cream and sugar in a china cup, and calling her Mammy. I see yellow today too, the sun, the tulips, and eternal hope, until I see the light of heaven that she saw. I loved her. And to my own mother, Helen back here. Mom, I hope that this honors you as well. I know you want everybody to know what a wonderful family you came from. And I just wanted to share these stories, additional stories, about my mother's mother and father. And so the next time that I come, we'll start with the oldest daughter, the oldest child, and was the oldest daughter, Elizabeth Leona, that we all knew as Lizzie. Deborah Irene with story time and stories and lessons from my mother. Good evening.